The Prime Minister is standing firm on plans to make tech companies pay for Australian news. Under the proposed code, Google and Facebook will be required to reimburse media companies if they publish or post links to their stories. Google has declared it will stop Australians from accessing its search engine if the plan goes ahead. For more, I'm joined by Tama, who's a Professor of Internet Studies at Curtin University in Perth. Tama, thank you so much for your time. Was this to be expected that the tech companies, and can they follow through on these threats to remove parts of their service from Australians?
Certainly at a technical level, they are perfectly capable of removing their services. They are a private business after all and can remove their service from anyone, including all of Australia if they choose to. To be honest, it's unlikely that they would follow through with it. I think they are more than anything showing the logical outcome of not being able to operate in Australia under the terms that they would prefer. I think really it's about them saying, look how important we are, look what we do, and trying to barter for better terms under the code that's been proposed.
Yeah, the government's proposed media code doesn't specify how much the technology companies should pay news organisations for their content. Is that one of the problems you see with the code as it stands now?
Certainly the big tech giants are saying, look, it's not unreasonable to ask us to pay something. I think even they recognise that they are getting a lot of value out of Australian news producers, but at the same time entering into a code where there is no upper limit established reasonable cost for news content or for curating news content, not even displaying it themselves. I think that's a reasonable thing to expect in a code, and I think that's a real objection they've got, which I think is a fair one.
So how do you convince the likes of Google and Facebook to comply? You said everyone's sort of playing a bit of game of chicken at the moment.
Absolutely, and I think both sides are going to have to blink a little bit. I think Facebook and Google have got their own versions of paying for news already. I think they've rolled out things in the last 6 months, such as Google News Showcase, which has rolled out in Germany and apparently rolled out, or agreements were signed yesterday in France. So there are precedents for Google paying for news, but I think Google and Facebook would prefer it was much more on their terms. The Australian government would much prefer that they're the ones making the terms, and I think there's still a middle ground to be reached.
You mentioned France there, but they're doing it under a different way, aren't they? They're using copyright laws, is that correct?
Yeah, so they've entered into it's quite a different pathway, and it's because the EU itself has put through particular laws that France has now enacted. So it is a very different pathway to the one that Australia is following. But I think that the underlying principles are essentially the same, that there should be some recompense to news producers for creating content that Google then curates and adds value to for their users.
So what are the implications for Australian users then if the likes of Google and Facebook follow through on their threats? So Google says it will remove its search engine function from Australia. Facebook says it won't allow users to post news stories. I mean, what are the implications of that?
Well, the implications are quite challenging. I don't think we've had an Australia that doesn't have access to Google search for a long time. I guess the logical outcome would be it's a great time to be Bing, which is Microsoft's search engine. But also it sort of asks the question, what about all the underlying services like Gmail or Google Maps or things like that, which are also entrenched in the way that we use Google? Equally, we forget that Google runs the Android platform that many people's phones run. So there's lots of bits of Google that are connected that wouldn't work in the same way, that I think we would experience a different sort of digital landscape. But as I say, I think it's unlikely that Google would want to follow through on this threat. I think it's more that they just want everyone to remember just how much they do and why they want perhaps a bigger seat at the bargaining table here.
Yeah, so who's going to win this tussle, or do you think that there's going to be compromises on both sides?
I'm hopeful that there'll be compromises on both sides. I think the code as it's written is a little bit it's too broad in its wording, and I think that's not necessarily intentional in some places, but I do think the arbitration, the way that that's set up does, while the intention is for that to level the playing field so news producers can sort of come to the table meaningfully with the big digital giants, at the same time I think that process needs to be a bit clearer and have some upper limits built into it so that there is a clear parameters in which this code can work.
And what do you think the media organisations themselves are feeling about this and how it's going down?
Oh, look, I think for them this is less about Australia and more about Australia setting precedent that other countries would follow. I think Google has been, and Facebook have been terrified about one country establishing a firm way for that particular national government to make rules about what Google and Facebook should pay, because every other national government will go, oh, somebody's finally figured it out, we're all going to do exactly the same thing. And I think it's that precedent setting that is actually what the big tech giants are most afraid of.
Tama, really good to get your thoughts. Thanks for joining us.
Been my pleasure. Thank you.